All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Tony Flock. I'm here to welcome you to our national webinar on today, September 26, 2013. And we are lucky to today have a conversation with Mike Schmoker and Lisa Pianowski. Heads up on a couple of upcoming conferences. Should you like to find out more about any of the topics discussed today, please join us in New Orleans, Louisiana on the 5th and 6th of November for our Common Core State Standards Summit 2.0, getting ready for the next generation assessments. And boy, folks, that is something that every time I check them out, I think more and more about what we need to do to get ready for that. Then, of course, our 90-90-90 School Improvement Summit featuring Dr. Mike Schmoker on the 13th and 14th of November in Las Vegas, Nevada. If you'd like to find out more about these, please don't hesitate to contact Brooke Little at hmhco.com. With us today, ladies and gentlemen, are, of course, myself. I am Tony Flock, National Practice Director of the Services Strategy and Innovation Group at HMH. Lisa Pianowski is the Director of School Improvement Partnerships with the Leadership and Learning Center, and she is passionate about supporting teachers and leaders in creating compelling learning environments that reflect high expectations, promote student engagement, and produce results. Lisa's work with the center integrates her years of school improvement experience and curriculum leadership in standards-based education. She's been a public school educator for more than 22 years, even though she doesn't look it, and has most recently served as the Associate Superintendent of Academics and Accountability in Forsyth County, Georgia, before joining our team. Her team there was responsible for curriculum instruction, assessment, academic support programs, professional learning, and workforce development. She's presented at numerous national and state conferences and is a published author, holds a doctorate of education with a concentration in organizational leadership and change, master's in ed leadership, and a bachelor of science in education. And of course, our featured speaker for the day, folks, really needs no introduction, but I do get the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mike Schmoker. He is a former school administrator, English teacher, and football coach, and has written 5 books and dozens of articles for various education journals, newspapers, and for Time magazine. His most recent book is Focus, Elevating the Essentials to Radically Improve Student Learning, and previous bestseller, Results Now, How We Can Achieve Unprecedented Improvements in Teaching and Learning, was selected as a finalist for Book of the Year by the Association of Education Publishers. Dr. Schmoker has keynoted at hundreds of states, national and international events, and has consulted for school districts in state and provincial education departments throughout the U.S., Canada, and Australia. He now lives in Tempe, Arizona with his wife, Cheryl, and I'm assuming is an Arizona State football fan, being a former football coach. His other books include Results, The Key to Continuous School Improvement, and Results Now. So with that, folks, Mike and Lisa, welcome to our webinar today. I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Great.
Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for the introductions, Tony. Mike, we are thrilled to have you with us and join us in this conversation. And we're just going to go ahead and jump right in because everybody is anxious to hear from you. Certainly, we have all read Focus, Elevating the Essentials. And, of course, you have really honed in on some very simple concepts. And we need to really pay attention to these in the era of education that we're in. So why don't we just go ahead and jump in with, based on your work, what is your advice? What should we be focusing in on first?
Well, even before I talk about those things that I think we should be focusing on, I always like to preface it by saying, don't be surprised if these things are really quite obvious. And my job, I think, and frankly, I think all of us should take on the task of restating and repeating and clarifying fairly obvious things that have been around for quite some time. So having said that, I would move on to say on the next slide, most of us acknowledge the value of the principle that less is more. I think that if we truly embrace that principle with regard to the things we know best about improving education, I believe with all my heart that we would see the swiftest and most substantive leap forward in the history of public education. So the slide you're looking at right now kind of gives us an overview of the next few minutes we'll spend together. Number one, I just want to talk a little bit about this notion that less is more, and then the second piece will be what are those first things, which are really the best and most important things we should be doing, and we should be doing them first. What are those things? And I want to explain and demonstrate why they should be our highest priority.
That is fantastic, Mike, because I know that schools are struggling with the myriad of initiatives and programs and things that they have going on in their buildings, and certainly random acts of improvement seem to be flying everywhere. So we're anxious to hear about, what are those things that are most effective?
Well, random acts indeed, and we might even see some of those random acts in this next slide. Take a look at those bullets, folks. I could cover the walls of my office right now with the dozens of really quite high-profile initiatives that come at us every year. But here's a sampling, buried within which you'll find three of what I would say are without doubt the most important things we can begin with, our first things that would have more impact on student learning and achievement, college preparation, career preparation than anything else we could do. Take a moment, and especially if you're with someone else, take a look at that list and see if you can't identify the three which in combination are more powerful than all other initiatives combined. Take a moment and do that.
And I think you're really right, Mike. As people are reflecting, we could, I think schools could cover their hallways, much less your office, with the strategies and kind of those silver bullets that they think really work. So I think it'll be interesting to see what top three are most effective.
And the answers are, there they are. There they are. I cannot imagine a rational person, forgive me, thinking that we can adopt any initiative before we have a common content-rich curriculum installed in our school or district. The same goes for, I refer to cold calling and other checks for understanding, because those are really, as we'll see in just a few minutes, those are really the heart of an effective lesson. The attempt to see how well students are doing at each stage of the lesson is, it's been amply demonstrated. That's what distinguishes an effective teacher from someone who simply stands in front of students and talks. Thirdly, again, I don't know that it can be gainsaid that we need to multiply the number of minutes and hours, if you will, of time spent in school purposefully reading, talking, and writing every day. Those are the things which we need to be our first things, our highest priority that we need to get to right now before we do anything else that distracts us from those three.
And isn't that telling? Because we spend a lot of time on the other things that you have listed here, and oftentimes the three that really you're saying have the most benefit and could really elevate the achievement most quickly, sometimes those are not what we would consider a priority.
Indeed, they're not. And I think they explain, Alyssa, why we have the situation we have today. You can see this first quote from Tayak and Cuban, two gentlemen who I think are among our best educational historians. Look what they say about effective practices. And look at what Auden and Kelly similarly say. I think the explanation is simple. We're so busy pursuing initiatives that are that pale in comparison with our what I will call first things, that we simply don't get the traction we need. 30-some years into school improvement, school reform, call it what you will, and we have yet to truly and successfully implement the things that matter most. So let's get to let's turn our attention to those elements now.
So yeah, Mike. So that's definitely, as I read Focus, as many others on the line, you are able to really synthesize, what are those top three, and you give us an imperative as educators. You tell us, exactly what those big three are. So if you would, could you kind of elaborate on that for our audience and really speak to what you think is most imperative for us to be working on right now?
Well, I'm happy to, and I always like to say my work is about as unoriginal as it gets. These three, it took me years of frustration, if you will, to realize that these three are more important than anything else. And there they are in fairly short, stark terms: guaranteed curriculum. In other words, a curriculum that everyone in the school or system is teaching, because what's being taught was deliberately arrived upon. Number two, literacy, which has to be incorporated into that curriculum across the subject areas. And finally, effective lessons. All of this stuff, and even the elements of effective lessons, which we'll talk about soon, none of this stuff is brand new or cutting edge. We have to see that sometimes the best stuff is fairly old stuff we're familiar with, stuff that's been around a while. Once we have a point I want to make, I'm not completely against any initiative whatsoever. That wouldn't make sense at all. But I don't know that it makes sense before we have fully mastered those three for us to pursue other initiatives. And when we do pursue other initiatives, I wish we'd stop trying to get entire schools or districts to adopt something new before they've been piloted carefully at some level to where we're more ready to turn those initiatives over to people with greater confidence and experience, which makes that initiative succeed much better. So those are the three right there, and we might want to take a look at what curriculum, starting with curriculum, what curriculum ought to look like in its simplest and I think most powerful form in a moment here.
Well, and absolutely, and I think just with what you stated about not trying something new before it's actually tested or before you've mastered these key three elements, I think even though our audience is muted, I heard cheering. I'm not sure. Because I think that educators across our nation are drowning in all the work and the next new thing, and I think what you're saying is this is grounded in great research and evidence that until we have these three, nothing else should be added on. So let's talk a little bit about the curriculum. So as you're thinking about that first one, what is it that you recommend that we think about in terms of a guaranteed curriculum? How should it be organized?
You bet. The first thing to realize is that Bob Marzano and his associates looked at thousands of studies and arrived at least a tentative conclusion that curriculum could be, what he calls a guaranteed viable curriculum, could be the single largest factor that affects how many students will learn. It has to be content rich, of course has to be rich in reading, writing, and discussion. We've known that for decades, but we haven't gotten around to that yet. And it also has to be, when we say guarantee, just to simplify, it simply means that a parent does not have to worry that one teacher teaching a course is going to provide a quite different curriculum than the teacher right next door in the same hallway teaching the same course. They should receive something like a guarantee that in essence, no matter which teacher a kid gets, they're going to get the same good, rich content and standards. The viable piece simply means we have to stop pretending, that we can teach all the standards in our state documents. That's impossible. What we have to do is reduce down to a manageable number from our state standards. That means no less than cutting some out. We have to reduce down to the standards we deem most important. Once we have such guaranteed and viable curriculum, we have the largest factor at work for us in trying to educate students. Just to add a little bit of clarity, take a look at that last bullet, if you don't mind, where I have topics and texts. Read that, if you will. That's my best attempt at this point to define what I think curriculum ought to consist of: common, guaranteed, viable curriculum. Now, I'm going to contend, forgive me, we do not have such curriculum in our schools yet, and virtually all of my audiences, when I poll them, tell me that we do not have such curriculum. Just to get maybe a clearer sense and a visual, let's look at the next slide if we could, Lissa. And what I've done here is just shown the first week of the kind of curriculum I think every teacher deserves the minute they walk into a school. Someone, a department head, someone ought to walk up to them before school begins and say, here is a document that tells you what to teach each week. It even tells you, for the most part, the best materials that we think you can use. And it provides some guidance about what kind of work to do with those materials. In this case, you see a U.S. history course, week 1, taxation without representation is one of the 2 topics, not 5, not 8, just 2 topics, which the teacher needs to concentrate on that week. They would add a certain amount of lecture on some other topics around this larger topic of the American Revolution, but those are the 2 real topics we're going to tackle. Take a look at the text column. There's no ambiguity about what the focus of the lesson is going to be. Just a few pages, not the whole chapter, for taxation without representation, and then a primary resource for British attitudes and treatment of the colonists. In both cases, take a look at the last column. We have questions that inform that inform the reading, the learning, the discussion, and the writing. Very simple. So much of our curriculum across the board, not all of it, but a great amount, should be tackled in this fashion, where we have a topic, a carefully chosen text, a good question that informs the reading, the discussion, the writing, and constitutes, this is the beauty of it, the assessment itself, which we do in the form of assessing both discussion and writing, whether it's short or long. I think every teacher deserves something like that.
Well, and I think this is so spot on, Mike. You know, one of the things that we've discussed is that, you know, even in the Common Core, the viability of us being able to teach, for instance, Common Core ELA standards, there are 91 different standards and elements within 3rd grade, which is a critical grade for reading. And we are kidding ourselves if we think that we can actually have teachers teach and assess each of those so that students can master them in the amount of time that they have. So absolutely the viability is critical, and I think that your emphasis on text here is also very much in support of what districts and schools are struggling with in terms of identifying the right text, the text complexity, but also certainly embedding more nonfiction, and then leading with these critical questions. So this is absolutely order of the day in terms of what...
and Mike, sorry to interject, but right on your topic, we got a couple of questions in from Tracy and from Keith. Tracy said that this contradicts what state of Louisiana is saying, that the state says every teacher has the authority to choose what to teach, and goes on to say we all have Common Core state standards, but no one is allowed to dictate what to teach due to evaluation ratings. And so it looks like there is some flexibility, some freedom out there. And then Keith says we've just completed a book study on focus. How would you suggest we garner a consensus on what these 3 components look like on our campus? And then once you guys respond to that, I'll go to Jeff's question.
Typically do better with one question at a time. And
Sorry, Mike.
And so just taking that first question, I would say we will always have, and there will always be, forgive me, the pretense of the state saying, well, you know, you have to teach these. Well, I always want to say you can't ask someone to do something that's impossible. We cannot actually and adequately teach all the standards in our documents, in our standards documents. We have to at some point, and let's be honest, folks, we've always decided at the classroom and the school level to a great degree on what we're actually going to teach. The bottom line is the school, the community, the state itself is going to be happy if more students learn. So we have to go with what the research tells us so emphatically, and that is we have to reduce standards down to the essentials and then teach to those, which does what? It actually increases the odds that everyone will actually teach the best of the standards in any state document. It increases the odds exponentially. And so I would just say, have those discussions at your school. Let's be realistic and realize if you can't teach all of them, we better decide on teaching the ones that matter most.
And so, thanks, Mike. Keith asked, how would you suggest we garner consensus after having done a book study on focus? How would you suggest we garner consensus on what those three components would look like on our campus?
Well, to be honest with you, that is the answer to that question, with due respect, is going to be this entire presentation. So as I continue to address the curriculum and the next two essential components, that really constitutes pretty much my best answer. And you'll see opportunities to implement and apply what you read about in the book.
And
I think
questions.
that so much of it is, oh, go ahead, Tony.
Thanks, Lisa. Sorry, scrolling down the list. Jeff asks, what do we do when we lack the materials for all teachers to go in the same sequence, or are we able to move separately?
I can answer that quickly. I really believe that if you really want to optimize learning, you have to have approximately the same sequence, without which the common curriculum falls apart, and you can't have effective collaboration, and you certainly can't do common assessment.
And last question at this point from Angela. Angela states that she can wrap her mind around the common curriculum when content is involved. What she's struggling with is when you're teaching early or emergent readers, or even third or fourth grade readers, when it's a combination of teaching content, you have to read something, but also reading to demonstrate literate behavior, summarizing, synthesizing, fluency, phonics, etc. How do you put that type of learning in order?
Gosh,
that's a big one.
I have to admit, I can't wrap my brain around that question. I can only kind of tackle a piece of it, I guess. I heard something that seemed to hint at you have to give students sometimes a kind of good content-rich text. Again, I favor, and the literature supports this, and it's actually part of the rationale for the Common Core. We have to stop being afraid of giving the same text to virtually every student in the classroom, and then ramp up and scaffold in such a way that helps all students. That's where the focus needs to be. We have to get past this notion that any teacher has time to divide students into 4, 5, 6 groups, provide them with very different texts, and assume that they're getting the same curriculum. That just ain't so.
All right. Thanks, Mike, for fielding those. Lisa, sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. I love the questions. Please keep them coming. And to that end, we actually want to pose a question to you. So,
all right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do our first poll of the session. We'd like for you to take a moment, please, and given Mike's definition of a guaranteed and viable curriculum, how would you rate the current curriculum that you have from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not well defined, through 5 guaranteed and viable? Please take a minute and make a selection on there. All right. We already have 33% of you voting. Excellent. So far, it looks like right in the middle is kind of leading Mike and Lisa. We'll give them another 30 seconds or so.
Great. Well, we appreciate the insight. We imagine that many of you are somewhere in process with revising documents, creating documents. I think the questions that were posed by our participants are absolutely what we hear in the field, struggling with that balance, struggling with materials, struggling with what the state's saying and what you know to be best practice. So this is great conversation today.
All right, looks like it's kind of wrapping up there, and we'll see the results here in just a second. There you go.
And that corresponds pretty much with what I see all over the country, frankly, and that is that most people would be in the 3 and 5 categories, either in progress or forgive me, in the 1 through 3 categories. Please forgive me. We're just not there yet, even though we have an abundance of curriculum documents. That just tells me we have a ways to go here. And I always like to say, let's not overcomplicate the building of curriculum. If it looks much more complicated than that U.S. history example I shared, I always worry. The more moving parts a curriculum has, the fewer people will understand it and actually implement it. So having said that, The second part we're going to tackle here in a moment, which has to do with literacy, is in a way not even a second part. There are times I'm tempted to put curriculum and literacy into one, because if you have a curriculum that does not have, it isn't adequately rich in text and opportunities to read, talk, and write, I don't believe we have a curriculum. So curriculum, by definition, has to be literacy rich.
Well, and I think this is definitely something that we're all focusing in on, and is certainly across disciplines. Because of our Common Core focus in ELA, the literacy standards, we are all thinking about collaborating around, what is authentic literacy? What does it look like? How can we embed that in our classrooms, and which typically means a change in practice. And I know you've got some great evidence that supports that we need to really be focusing in on that now.
Well, thanks, Lisa. And any discussion of literacy, I always like to just back up for a moment and reflect on thoughts like the ones you're looking at right now. Literacy, Phillips and Wong write, I love this quote, it's the spine that holds everything together in all subject areas. I'll admit it probably isn't as critical, say, to music or some areas of art as it is to English, social studies, math, and science, and any number of other electives, by the way, including vocational. But without that foundation of literacy, it's damn hard to get an education. And take a look at what Richard Vaca says. For those who think that we've entered some kind of new high-tech age that doesn't require reading and writing, look at what Richard Vaca says, and even Thomas Friedman has made similar remarks over time. So given that, what do we do is the big question. And in so brief a presentation as this one, I can only sort of fast forward to what the Common Core, and this is an important point, folks, and I wish I had more time to elaborate, but let me ask you to consider something. Consider avoiding or keeping some distance from the lists of standards. As Lisa pointed out earlier, there's 90-some at each grade level for the Common Core in the English language arts. The very fact that they have parsed these literacy skills into dozens and dozens, approaching even as many as 100 per grade level, is a problem. Many of them, as I've written about, and you can look up my work on this, the Common Core, and how difficult they are to read and understand. This has really hurt our opportunity to move forward quickly on this critical front. If we really want to move forward, look at these instructional shifts, which the Common Core people finally came up with to help us clarify. And this is at every grade level, folks. These aren't for a certain grade level. This is for kindergarten, virtually for kindergarten through 12th grade and beyond. Those three, a focus on building knowledge through content-rich reading materials, focusing on evidence from the text, literary and informational, often in the form of argument, and obviously a focus on complex text and learning academic language embedded within the texts we're reading. That's where the action is. And if I may just sidebar for half a moment, we need to stop being addicted to these elaborate vocabulary building programs. Most language is learned by providing kids with enormous, by today's standards, amounts of time to read and to learn the vocabulary within the texts that they're reading, with a little bit of direct instruction in vocabulary. Marzano says about 20 words per year per discipline, 20 academic terms. Beyond that, most of what we learn should be words that come right out of the text that we're reading, talking about, writing about. So, again, having laid that foundation, the trouble is, as we'll see in the next slide, traditionally, this is what our curriculum's been. I hardly need to elaborate. This is the stuff. Take a look there, folks. That is the stuff which has prevented us from devoting sufficient time to true reading and writing activities.
And Mike, I think we would all say that many of the things that Lucy Calkins and you're referencing here in terms of the stuff, this is a lot of the things that we're seeing in our classrooms today. And so really trying to illuminate for teachers, what is authentic literacy, reading, writing, discussion, what is that supposed to look like in the context of their classroom today, I think is a real challenge.
Well, it really is, and again, as you say, this really is what we see for the most part. I would say that it's easily a ratio of 4 or 5 to 1, which is the ratio that I saw in my own daughter's education. And they're in their early 20s, and I remember so recently, even in schools that were launching all kinds of reforms and programs, they still were obsessed with the multiple choice, test prep curriculum, and way too much poster making, book jacket design, such things as that. Folks, and I say very little, I mean almost no opportunity to really analyze, discuss, and write about substantive texts. This is the thing we have to wean ourselves from. And when we do, I think we're going to see something like, forgive me, a golden age in education. When we move from the stuff you see on that screen to even the most obvious forms of reading, close reading, discussion, and writing. We're going to see an educational system that is exponentially more effective than the one that currently prevails. So
right, and you're not saying that these are, if set in the right context, some of these activities would be okay, but it has to be set in the right context. So let's, if you will, let's talk a little bit about lesson design, because I know teachers on the line and leaders on the line are probably thinking, okay, this sounds great, but how do we move from making really meaningful learning experience for students? So in terms of lesson design, I know in your book Focus, you outline a few really essential components that every teacher should think about so that we have consistency in terms of the work. So let me let you go ahead and elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, if I may just briefly refer back to that last slide, and you don't necessarily have to show it, most of those things up there, book jackets, poster making, cutting, gluing, collages, I really think we do need to stop and ask ourselves, is there ever a time in an English class where we need to be doing those things? They are so time invasive, no one's ever demonstrated they have any connection whatsoever to helping a kid become more literate, more college prepared, more career bound. I've never seen evidence for it. I don't expect that we will. But let's move now, though, into the next phase. Which focusing? Well, again, don't be terribly surprised if this stuff is fairly familiar to most of us. Bob Marzano says in this beautiful statement here that we all need to be able to describe effective teaching in a way that's almost a test. I'd love to walk into a building and say to any teacher, describe to me what you think effective teaching consists of. That similar way that Bob Marzano talks about, I would love to hear them all say something like we see in the next slide. Terms might vary somewhat. One will agree we need every kid paying attention. And if I may say, I spend so much time in classrooms. I spent the last 2 days walking through schools. You almost never see every kid truly looking at the teacher when the teacher is instructing, or truly engaged in the work once it's been assigned. There's a whole conversation there, but steps need to be taken to tackle that. The next thing is we have to have a clear learning objective or target. Any of these elements could be discussed at length, but I can only say, if you're in the mood, put learning objective Robert Marzano in Google and look at the research that shows how powerful and foundational that component is to the entire rest of the lesson. Once we get that lesson up there, we have to sell it to students, give them some kind of notion of why it's important, give them a sense of purpose for why this is worth studying or learning, and a preview of the lesson. All of this builds anticipation, curiosity, a sense of relevance. Then we begin to teach, and the name of the game with this element, whether we teach or model or show or think out loud, is small chunks or slices, because all of us learn best in small amounts, followed immediately by what? Opportunities to practice, but it has to be guided practice in the sense that as the student practices what we just taught or modeled, we have to guide that practice by checking for understanding, walking around, seeing how well students are doing on that particular step or chunk of the lesson. That's called checks for understanding. If we see they're not doing so well, we have to reteach. We have to have students pair up and help each other and get that chunk or step and demonstrate understanding of that step before we move to the next one. Those three bullets in the middle, teach, guided practice, checks for understanding, those are the soul of the lesson. And not until, for every phase of the lesson, not until all students have demonstrated at least rough mastery do we have the luxury of cutting them loose to do what? Engage in independent practice, which is tantamount to an assessment. Take a look at the names at the bottom of that slide, folks, so that I quite deliberately put there. Most of you watching this know most, if not all, of those names. Those people have been begging us for decades to acknowledge that these simple elements make all the difference in the world. And when I do a longer presentation, I go into more detail on them. I tell stories of schools that just really took off and did it, mind you, with a very simple, repetitive emphasis on making sure everybody understood and had mastered those elements before any other initiatives were introduced.
Well, and I think this is such a powerful slide, just how you've actually tied in what we know about good research and instruction, activating knowledge, the importance of kids collaborating, their metacognitive thinking, communicating within the classroom, and then, of course, applying their knowledge immediately with feedback. And I think, you know, we all, like you said, these are relatively simple things. They've been talked about for years. We have the research. They are best practice, but we continue to see that they're not always common practice. So I think if we were able to focus in on these essential elements in our lesson design, it would take us so far.
Well, it would, and truly, the way you put it nicely, Lissa, is that they're essential practices, but they're not common practices. The moment they become common practice, forgive me, people like me will be out of a job, and that will be just fine.
Well, and that all takes, you know, a level of leadership. I mean, I know we've got teachers and leaders on the line, and, you know, as everyone is engaging in these professional learning communities, I know that you've talked about, you know, a couple key elements that really could help us further this work and help us focus on these key pieces. So would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit as we kind of wrap up our discussion today? You know, what are the things that we can walk away and do right now?
Well, there's really only two things I highly recommend that people do, and I recommend they do them first, is just master these two basic processes. Just learn to do what I call sort of data-driven walkthroughs, where you train your faculty in whatever it is that you're tackling for that week or 2 weeks or month. It might be something as simple as one of the elements of an effective lesson, like you're looking during a particular week only for properly written learning objectives. Now, before you do that kind of a walkthrough, train everyone in them. Teach learning objectives, the writing of good learning objectives, to your faculty in the same way that we would teach a classroom full of students how to master them. And once they master that, then we go out and do a true assessment by walking through the school and seeing what percentage of classrooms have prominently posted learning objectives. We use that percentage as a check for understanding to see if we don't need to go, subsequently, perhaps, to go over learning objectives again if more help is needed. If everyone has mastered that, we can go on to the next element, whether it's whether it's ensuring that common curriculum is being implemented, whether people are mastering the use of checks for understanding, doesn't matter. We just continually do this kind of work through simple walkthroughs that don't have to take more than 30, 40 minutes a pop, a couple, 3 times a month, and then the results are shared at faculty meetings. That's number one. Number two, let's just start making a habit in every school of building in at least quarterly assessments, every grading period. Sometimes in some schools, sometimes twice every grading period, interim assessments that give us a chance to stop, take stock, see how many students are at or above good performance levels, and then discuss each team with an administrator, each team with a coach, each team with a teacher leader or department head, how well we're doing, what we need to do in the near future to get even better results. I believe those two things will take us a long, long way.
And both of those, Mike, really emphasize data-driven collaboration. The walkthroughs and the teams actually meeting together around those common assessments, a huge part of what we advocate for at the center. And we have seen over the last 10, 20 years research of studies of schools and districts that we've worked with that this is the promising practice. This works, and it is the only way, to close the achievement gap. We've got to close the implementation gap. People need to be in classrooms monitoring and looking to see what's happening. So your recommendations are absolutely right on target, Mike, as always. So, Tony, I know we had one last question.
We have several. I'm not certain that we're going to be able to get them in towards the end, but the question that Kyle asked, I'm sorry, let me back up. It was Brandon, was related to vocabulary. He said, do you feel that the purpose of the text would be lost if some time was not spent giving a guided tour of the difficult vocabulary used in the reading?
Oh, on the contrary, I fully agree with what you're saying. Before we teach, this is one of those things that I go into some detail on, actually in my book, as well as in my presentation. That's exactly what we need to do, is identify, the teacher needs to carefully read every text they ever put in front of students. Part of that is to identify the vocabulary which they think are most critical to helping every student to more fully understand the text. It doesn't mean you have to teach every imaginable difficult word, but you choose the ones that are most essential to an understanding of that text. Couldn't agree more.
And I think what you were saying earlier, Mike, is about the very scripted vocabulary programs versus vocabulary embedded in text.
Thanks for clarifying that. Yes. I walk into classrooms and instead of reading, students are matching vocabulary, learning long lists of Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. I frankly think that's madness.
And Tony, did you have another question?
I'm trying to kind of prioritize here with time. Angela asks a question regarding managing a calendar. If we suggest that teachers not move on until most or all of our students have rough mastery, how do you plan or arrange a calendar to guide teachers? And when do you know how to move on to the next concept?
If I understand the question correctly, here's the best we can do. All we can do is write a curriculum that represents, number one, a reduced number of standards on some sort of intelligently arrived at timetable with what we consider to be enough space to teach those most essential standards and enough time to build in sufficient amounts of reading, discussion, and writing. Once we do that, yes, there will be times when we might feel like we're getting a little bit behind or a little bit ahead, and we'll make adjustments as a team. That's why teams get together to say, how well is the schedule working? Especially the first year you do this kind of work, there's going to be some real adjustments to our schedules. But let's not forget, when we teach according to that familiar design that starts with clear learning objectives, small chunks, guided practice, check for understanding, we underestimate grossly how much faster that kind of teaching is. According to Dylan William, who's about the best researcher on this topic, we can cover between 2 and 4 times as much material. I'm going to say that again. When we teach sound lessons, we can cover 2 to 4 times as much material. One of the biggest reasons is that conventional worksheet-driven instruction, or conventional instruction that explains things once and is followed by the teacher running around frenetically trying to tutor all the different students who didn't get it. That kind of teaching forces us to only be able to, it prevents us from being able to cover near as much ground as we could.
That's a great point. The more effective the lesson, the more ground we can cover. So,
Indeed.
Great point.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, as we draw towards the end of our time, we are at 45 minutes. We understand if some of you need to sign off, and again, a reminder, this will be recorded. We have one last poll for you. If you would, please take a look at your screen and select which of the 3 elements that you believe represents your greatest need in the schools in which you work or the schools and districts that you serve. Got a couple of folks voting here. It's kind of kind of an even split. No, leaning more towards authentic literacy. I feel like I'm calling a horse race as we go here. We've got about 40% of folks responding. Neck and neck between B and C.
It's interesting as we were, as Mike and I were talking about this, you know, ideally we need to be addressing all of them, but we know that in some schools, you know, being able to prioritize what is your greatest need, we were quite interested to see, you know, the participants, you know, what is it that you think you have to address first while really trying to work towards all 3.
All right, and you see the results there on your screen, folks. It was an almost even split between authentic literacy and effective lessons at 46 and 43% respectively. As we draw our time to a close, ladies and gentlemen, please remember to mark your calendar. Our next School Improvement Summit is November 13th and 14th in Las Vegas, Nevada, and we will be joined by Dr. Mike Schmoker at that summit, so looking forward to seeing him there. Any other questions or reflections that you have beyond today's seminar, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via our website. This webinar and slides will be posted at www.leadandlearn.com/resource center. In addition to this webinar, Mike has generously offered to share a recent article that he wrote along with Carol Jago in the Kappa Delta Pi record from April. That will be posted there as well. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today. Any questions that we were unable to address will be forwarded on over to Alyssa and to Mike to be responded to in the future. And if you have any other questions about how we might be able to assist you in this work, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the center. Your best contact there will be Kyle Helfrich, our National Sales Manager, who would be glad to follow up with you. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for your time today. Mike and Lissa, thank you for your contributions to our webinar. We appreciate your knowledge and sage advice.
You're quite welcome, Tony. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, everyone, for participating with us in this conversation today.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for a great webinar, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Again, this will be posted in approximately 48 hours for you to download and share with your colleagues who are not able to join us. Have a wonderful day.